The girl did not cry. She went upstairs, folded her clothes, and packed her bag so her brother would be allowed to stay. I remember the sound of her small feet on the staircase, more than I remember my own son's voice saying the words that sent her there, though God knows I have replayed both 1,000 times since. It was Christmas night. The turkey was still warm on the table, the good china still catching the light from the candles I had lit that morning, the same candles I light every year, because Rachel always said a table without candlelight was just a table with food on it. 11 people sat around that table. 10 of them kept eating. One 11-year-old girl sat frozen, with her fork halfway to her mouth, staring at her Uncle Daniel as if she had misheard him, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something kinder if she simply waited. "Keep the boy," Daniel had said, not even lowering his voice, not even pretending it was a private matter. "The girl isn't ours. We'll figure out where she goes after the holidays." Silence has a texture. I did not know that until that moment. It pressed down on the room like a hand over a mouth. My daughter-in-law's mother, visiting from Pittsburgh, set down her wine glass so carefully it made no sound at all. My grandson Ethan, 9 years old, looked from his sister to his uncle and back again, his face crumpling the way a child's face does right before the whole world tips sideways. And Nora, 11 years old. Rachel's daughter, David's daughter in every single way that word had ever meant anything in our house, folded her napkin, set it beside her plate, and said in a voice so quiet I had to lean forward to hear it, "May I be excused?" Nobody stopped her. I want you to sit with that for one moment, the way I have sat with it every day since. Nobody stopped her. 10 grown adults, 4 of them her own blood relatives by the technical accounting my son suddenly cared so much about, and not one of them reached out a hand. Except that is not entirely true. I stopped her. Just not yet. Not in that first breath. In that first breath, I sat there with my heart going so hard I could feel it in my teeth, trying to understand what my son, my own son, had just done to a child who called him Uncle Danny and made him a birthday card every October without fail. If you have ever had a moment like that, a moment when you realized someone you loved had shown you exactly who they were, and you were the only one still holding the fork, I think you already know where this story is going. And if you are watching this from your kitchen table tonight, tell me in the comments where you're joining us from, because stories like this one deserve to be heard by people who understand what family is actually supposed to mean. My name is Margaret. I was 68 years old that Christmas, a retired school teacher, a widow of 11 years, and for 2 years before that dinner, I had been the only mother those 2 children had left. To understand what happened at that table, and what happened 3 days later in a courtroom on the 2nd floor of the county building, you need to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of that dinner, the beginning of everything. My son David was my firstborn. He had his father's laugh and my stubbornness, a dangerous combination that got him into trouble twice in high school and out of trouble 100 times after. He married Rachel when he was 26, and I loved her before I ever loved her as a daughter, because she looked at my son the way you look at something you intend to keep. Nora came to them first, and she came to them differently. Rachel had a younger sister, Callie, troubled in ways that a small town does not forgive easily. And when Callie found herself unable to care for the baby she'd had at 19, Rachel did not hesitate. She drove 4 hours in a snowstorm to bring that infant home, and she and David adopted her within the year. And from that day forward, in every practical and spiritual sense, Nora was their daughter. There was no asterisk on her birth certificate that mattered to anyone in that house. There was no lesser love. I watched Rachel rock that baby to sleep the exact same way she would later rock Ethan, and I watched David walk the floor with her at 2 in the morning with the exact same exhausted devotion. 2 years later, Rachel had Ethan, a fat, cheerful baby who slept through the night at 6 weeks and never gave anyone a moment's worry in his life. I tell you this so you understand precisely how monstrous my son's words were. Nora was not a foster child passing through. She was not a favor being done. She was 11 years old, and she had been Nora Ellison since she was 4 months old, and the only person in that entire family who ever treated her blood as a relevant fact was the man who stood up from my table on Christmas night and decided, apparently, that biology outranked 11 years of bedtime stories. The accident happened on a Tuesday in March, 2 years before that Christmas. I remember the day of the week because I have never since been able to hear the word Tuesday without my stomach dropping. David and Rachel were driving home from a parent-teacher conference at Ethan's school, taking the back roads because the highway was backed up, and a delivery truck ran a stop sign at the intersection of Miller Road and County Line. The impact was, according to the report I read only once and then never again, instantaneous for both of them. They did not suffer. That was the only mercy anyone could offer me in the weeks that followed, and I clung to it the way you cling to anything when the ground has opened beneath your feet. I was 66 years old, and I buried my son on a Thursday in early April, the daffodils just starting to come up along the church walkway, obscene in their cheerfulness. 2 children stood beside me at that graveside, one 7 years old and one 9, both of them wearing clothes I had bought 2 days earlier, because grief does not wait for anyone to think ahead, and both of them looking up at me with the exact same question in their eyes, though neither one asked it out loud. What happens to us now? I will tell you what I told myself in that moment, standing over my son's grave with my hands on the shoulders of his children. I told myself that whatever else happened, whatever grief did to me in the years that followed, those two would never again wonder, even for a single day, whether they belonged somewhere. I made that promise to a hole in the ground and to 2 shaking children, and I meant it with everything left inside me. Daniel came to the funeral, of course. He is my younger son, 4 years behind David, and I want to be fair to him here, because a woman telling this story owes the truth even to the person who wounded her worst. Daniel grieved his brother. I watched him cry at that graveside, real tears, the kind that come from somewhere true. Whatever came later, whatever he became capable of saying at my dinner table 2 years afterward, I do not believe he stood there that April day already planning it. Grief does strange things to people over time. It does not excuse what it eventually reveals, but it explains at least where the crack first opened. The first sign of trouble came 6 weeks after the funeral, at a family meeting I called at my kitchen table to talk about logistics, about school schedules and Nora's dance lessons, and who would take Ethan to his Saturday baseball games. Daniel's wife, Vanessa, brought up the subject nobody had wanted to say out loud yet. "We should talk about long-term," she said, stirring sugar into coffee she did not drink. "About what happens if something changes. About whether it makes sense to keep them together long-term, given the circumstances." I asked her what circumstances she meant, though I already suspected the answer sitting in my chest like a stone. "Nora isn't David's, biologically," Vanessa said, as though she were reading me a weather report. "I just think it's worth having on the table. If anything were ever to happen to you, Margaret, the state might look at things differently for the 2 of them. Ethan's clearly blood. Nora's situation is more, well, it's more complicated." I want you to understand something about me before we go further into this story. I taught fourth grade for 31 years. I have looked into the eyes of a great many children who were being told, in ways large and small, that they were less wanted than the child beside them. And I have watched what that does to a young soul over time, slowly, like water finding a crack in stone. I was not going to let it happen in my own family. Not to my own granddaughter. I told Vanessa, quite calmly, that Nora's situation was not complicated at all, that she had been my son's daughter from the moment he signed the papers, and that the conversation was finished. It was not finished. It simply went underground for 2 years, surfacing in small, cruel increments that I cataloged in my mind the way you catalog anything you suspect you will one day need to defend. A birthday gift for Ethan that cost 3 times what Nora received. A comment at Easter about how Nora took after her real mother's side when she got upset about something trivial. A Christmas card, the year before the one I am telling you about now, addressed to Daniel, Vanessa, and family, with a smaller card tucked inside meant only for Ethan. A $50 bill folded into it. Nothing for his sister at all. I noticed every single one of these moments. I said nothing most of the time because I did not yet understand how far the current ran beneath the surface. That was my mistake, and it is one I have made peace with only slowly, over time. Because hindsight is a luxury grief does not usually afford you until much later. But here is the thing you should know about me. The thing that becomes important later in this story. I may not have said much out loud in those 2 years. I am not, by nature, a confrontational woman. I was raised to keep the peace, to smooth things over, to let sleeping resentments lie rather than wake them. But quiet does not mean unprepared. Quiet, I have learned, can be its own kind of armor if you use the silence to build something rather than simply to endure. 8 months after the funeral, on a rainy Tuesday in November, I drove myself to the office of an attorney named Grace Whitfield, whose name I had gotten from my church friend Carol after Carol's own sister went through a similar situation with her late husband's estate. I sat in Grace Whitfield's office with my hands folded in my lap, and I told her everything. I told her about the accident, about the 2 children now sleeping in my home every night, about the comments Vanessa had made, about the uneasy feeling that had been growing in my stomach since that very first kitchen table meeting. And I asked her a question that I had been turning over in my mind for months, one I was almost afraid to say out loud, because saying it made it real. If something happened to me, I asked her, or if my family ever tried to separate these 2 children, split them up because one of them isn't technically blood, is there anything I can do now, while I'm alive and well, to stop that from ever happening? Grace Whitfield looked at me for a long moment before she answered. The way people look at you when they are deciding how much truth you can bear. Then she told me about permanent legal guardianship, a status entirely separate from the temporary arrangement I had fallen into after the accident, one that would require a court hearing, a home study, character references, and a judge's formal order naming me the sole legal guardian of both Ethan and Nora Ellison, with equal and identical legal standing for each child, regardless of biology, regardless of what anyone in my family ever chose to say at a dinner table 5 years down the road. It would be permanent, she told me, court-ordered, not something a family member could simply overrule with an opinion at Christmas dinner. I did not tell Daniel. I did not tell Vanessa. I did not, God forgive me, even tell my closest friends, because I understood something in my bones that I could not yet fully articulate, something I only came to understand fully on Christmas night 2 years later. I understood that if I told anyone what I was doing, someone in this family would find a way to make it a fight before it ever became a fact. So I did it quietly. I filed the petition in January. I sat through a home study where a kind, tired social worker named Diane walked through every room of my house, checked the smoke detectors, asked Nora and Ethan separately whether they felt safe and loved, and wrote in her report words I still keep folded in my Bible. Both children demonstrate strong, secure attachment to their grandmother and describe her home as their home. The hearing itself, that first hearing, was almost anticlimactic. A judge named Renata Cole, a woman with silver hair pulled back so tightly it looked as though it might be the only thing holding her composure in place after a long docket of family tragedies, reviewed the file, asked me 3 questions, and signed an order. I remember the exact date because I have looked at it more times than I can count since. March 14th. Case number, the kind of string of letters and numbers you never think you'll need to memorize until suddenly you have it memorized without trying. Permanent legal guardian of Ethan David Ellison and Nora Rachel Ellison, both minors, effective immediately, superseding any prior informal arrangement. I drove home from that courthouse with the order folded into my purse, and I put it in a manila folder in the bottom drawer of my desk, beneath old tax returns and warranty cards for appliances I no longer owned, and I told no one it was there. Not because I was ashamed of it, because I hoped with everything in me that I would never need to take it out again. I hoped Daniel's comments would remain comments, the ugly murmurs of grief and jealousy that families sometimes produce and then, eventually, outgrow. I was wrong about that. I want to be honest with you about how wrong I was, because the truth of this story only matters if I tell it plainly. I believed, for almost 2 years, that time would soften Daniel's resentment, that watching Nora grow, watching her excel in school, watching her sit beside her brother at every dinner and every holiday and every ordinary Tuesday would remind him what family actually was. Instead, the opposite happened. The resentment did not soften. It calcified. Vanessa's remarks became more frequent, more pointed, delivered now with a kind of confidence, as though she had convinced herself she was simply speaking a truth no one else was brave enough to say. And Daniel, who had cried real tears at his brother's graveside, began, slowly, to nod along. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from watching a slow betrayal happen in real time and being unable to stop it, only to document it, only to prepare for it because you cannot make a grown man love a child the way he is supposed to. You can only protect that child from what happens when he doesn't. I spent 2 years doing exactly that, loving Nora and Ethan with everything in me, and quietly, silently, keeping that folder in the bottom drawer, hoping I would never need it, knowing, in the part of myself I trusted most, that I probably would. Which brings us back to that Christmas table, to the candles and the good china, and the words that finally, after 2 years of murmurs and folded cards and unequal birthday envelopes, came out into the open air where everyone could hear them. Keep the boy. The girl isn't ours. I have relived the seconds right after those words more times than I can count, trying to understand my own paralysis in that moment, the way shock locks the body in place even when every instinct screams to move. Nora set down her fork. She asked to be excused in a voice so composed it broke something in me even deeper than tears would have. And she walked up the stairs of my house, the house she had lived in for 2 years, The house with her name written in crayon on the doorframe of her bedroom from the summer she turned 9. And she began, quietly, methodically, to pack a bag. The silence in that dining room stretched longer than any silence has a right to stretch. And I remember thinking, even as I sat frozen in my own chair, that I could hear the refrigerator humming 2 rooms away, that ordinary domestic sound suddenly unbearably loud against the wreckage of what had just been said out loud at my own table. Rachel's mother, Eleanor, who had driven up from Pittsburgh 3 days earlier with a suitcase full of gifts wrapped in paper she had clearly chosen with Nora's favorite color in mind, sat with her hand still resting on the stem of that wine glass, not lifting it, not setting it down further, simply frozen there, her face doing something complicated that I did not have time in that moment to fully read. I would learn later, much later, what that expression had actually been. It was not shock alone. It was recognition. Eleanor, it turned out, had heard smaller versions of Daniel's cruelty whispered at other gatherings over the previous 2 years. Quiet asides she had chosen, out of a desire to keep the peace, not to repeat to me. I did not know that yet, sitting at that table. I only knew that an old woman who loved her granddaughter fiercely had gone very still and very pale, and that her silence, like everyone else's, had not been enough to stop what was already happening. My younger sister-in-law, Carol's cousin Beth, who had married into the family through my late husband's side and came to every holiday more out of habit than closeness, set down her fork with a small, deliberate click against the china, the only sound in the room besides the refrigerator, and I saw her glance toward the hallway where Nora had disappeared, and then glance toward Daniel, and then look down at her own plate as though the mashed potatoes had suddenly become the most important thing in the room. I do not blame her for that. I have come, in the years since, to understand something about the particular paralysis that grips ordinary, decent people when cruelty happens in front of them without warning. The way the mind simply refuses, for several long seconds, to accept that the thing it just witnessed actually happened the way it happened. I felt that same paralysis myself sitting there, my hands flat on the tablecloth, my heart slamming against my ribs while my body remained inexplicably, completely still. I thought, in those frozen seconds, about the 2 years that had led us to this exact table, this exact dinner, this exact sentence spoken in front of a room full of people who loved these children, and had still, somehow, allowed the current beneath the surface to grow this strong without anyone standing up to interrupt it. I thought about Diane's home study, conducted 18 months after the accident, and the particular afternoon she had sat at my kitchen table with Nora alone, just the 2 of them, while I stood in the hallway trying not to eavesdrop and failing completely. I heard Diane ask her, gently, whether she ever felt like she did not belong in this family, and I heard my granddaughter, then only 9 years old, answer without a moment's hesitation that she belonged here more than anywhere else in the whole world, because this was where her mama and daddy had raised her, and her grandma made her oatmeal exactly the way her mama used to, with cinnamon and no raisins, and her brother slept with the door open so she would not be scared of the dark. I had cried in that hallway, silently, my hand pressed over my mouth, grateful beyond words that a 9-year-old could still say those things with such easy, unguarded certainty. I thought, too, about the incidents I had cataloged so carefully in the 2 years since, the way you catalog anything you suspect you will one day need to defend, though I had never let myself fully imagine the day would arrive at my own dinner table with the whole family watching. There had been the 4th of July the year before, when Daniel's oldest daughter, Kayla, had turned to Nora at the community pool and asked, with the particular careless cruelty only a teenager repeating something she had overheard at home could manage, whether it was true that Nora's real mom had given her up because nobody wanted her. Nora had come home from that pool party quiet and pale, and it had taken me 3 days of gentle, patient conversation to get the story out of her. And when I finally called Daniel to ask where on earth his daughter had gotten an idea like that, he had laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Kids say the darndest things," as though a 12-year-old inventing a lie that specific and that cruel had simply materialized out of thin air rather than out of a conversation she had overheard at her own dinner table. There had been the Thanksgiving before that, when Vanessa had made a point, in front of the entire extended family, of asking loudly whether anyone had heard from Nora's biological mother, Callie, and whether there was, quote, any chance she might resurface someday and want her back, as though my granddaughter were a library book on an extended loan, rather than a child who had buried both of her parents and did not need, on a holiday meant for gratitude, to be reminded that some people in her own family still quietly filed her under temporary. I remember Nora's face at that table, the careful blankness she had already, even then, learned to arrange her features into whenever the conversation turned toward the fact of her adoption. A blankness I recognized now, with the clarity of hindsight, as the earliest version of the composure she would show 4 Christmases later while packing a duffel bag upstairs. I thought about all of it, sitting frozen at that table, every small cruelty I had noted and filed away and told myself I was handling, told myself I was managing, told myself the guardianship order in my desk drawer would be enough of a foundation to hold everything steady, even if the family around it kept crumbling in small, ugly increments. I understood in that frozen silence, watching Eleanor's hand still resting on her wine glass and Beth staring down at her mashed potatoes, and my son's face arranged into that expression of wounded practicality, that I had been wrong to believe managing was the same as protecting. I had built a fortress in a drawer. I had not built a wall around the dinner table itself, and a child had just been made to sit inside that unwalled space and absorb a blow I should have found some way to block 2 years earlier, the very first time Vanessa raised the subject at my own kitchen table, over coffee she did not drink. Ethan's chair creaked as he shifted in it, and I glanced at him, my grandson, 9 years old and utterly without armor, watching the space where his sister had just disappeared, with an expression I will never fully be able to describe to you. Some mixture of confusion and dawning terror, the particular terror of a child who has just understood, for the first time, that the people at this table might not all be on the same side. He looked at his Uncle Daniel, then at his father's empty chair, though, of course, his father had not sat at that table in over 2 years. Though some part of Ethan's mind, I think, in that moment, reached for David the way children reach for the people who are supposed to fix things, even when those people have been gone a very long time. Somewhere down the table, my late husband's brother, Frank, who came to Christmas every year mostly out of loyalty to a promise he had made at his own brother's deathbed to keep an eye on me, cleared his throat, the first sound made by anyone at that table since Nora's chair had scraped back from it, and said, in a voice pitched somewhere between disbelief and warning, "Daniel, that's not something you say in front of the kids." It was not much. It was not the intervention the moment deserved, but it was something, a single thread of decency thrown across that frozen silence, and I have always been grateful to Frank for being the first adult brave enough to say anything at all, even if what he said arrived a beat too late to stop the damage already done. Daniel did not look at his uncle. He looked at me instead, his jaw set in the particular way it used to set when he was 7 years old, and certain he was right about something even as the evidence mounted against him. and he said, "I'm not trying to upset anyone. I'm just being honest, and I don't understand why everyone's acting like honesty is some kind of crime in this family." Vanessa nodded beside him, her pearl earrings catching the candlelight. Her expression the particular composed righteousness of a woman who has convinced herself, over many quiet months, that cruelty, dressed carefully enough in the language of practicality, does not actually count as cruelty at all. I sat there, my hands still flat on the tablecloth, feeling something in my chest that I can only describe now, years later, as the sound of a very old dam beginning, finally, to crack. 2 years of quiet management and careful documentation and hopeful patience, all straining at once against a pressure I had allowed to build for far too long in the name of keeping the peace. I thought of the manila folder in my desk drawer, sitting exactly where I had left it that afternoon 2 years earlier, and some part of me, even in the middle of that frozen, ringing silence, understood that the time for keeping it quietly folded beneath old warranty cards had just, finally, unmistakably, come to an end. Ethan started crying first, a 9-year-old's confused, wounded sobbing, and that was the sound that finally broke my paralysis. I stood up from that table so fast my chair scraped against the hardwood floor loud enough to make the candles flicker, and I looked at my son. My living son, the one still breathing across that table from me, and for one terrible moment I did not know if I could forgive him. I am not proud of that moment. I am only telling you it happened, because I promised myself, telling this story, that I would tell it honestly. "What did you just say to that child?" I asked him, and my voice did not sound like my own voice. It sounded like something colder, something that had been waiting 2 years to speak. Daniel had the audacity, and I use that word deliberately, to look almost surprised at my reaction, as if he had said something perfectly reasonable and I was the one being dramatic. "Mom, come on. It's not like I'm saying it to be cruel. It's just facts. Ethan's blood. If something ever happens to you, and God forbid it does, the state's going to look at custody differently for a kid who isn't biologically connected to this family. I've been reading about it. I talked to a lawyer friend of mine. I'm just being practical, thinking ahead, the way somebody in this family needs to." "You told an 11-year-old girl she isn't yours," I said, "at my Christmas table, in front of her brother. On the holiday, her mother used to make her a stocking with her own initial embroidered on it by hand." "She's not going to remember this in 10 years, Vanessa said, and I want you to sit with the coldness of that sentence for a moment, because I have sat with it for 2 years now, and it has not gotten any less breathtaking. Kids are resilient, and frankly, Margaret, somebody needed to say it eventually. You've been raising them like it's some fairy tale where blood doesn't matter, and it does matter, legally, practically, it matters." I did not answer her. I could not, in that moment, trust my own voice to say anything that would not be a mistake I regretted. Instead, I walked past the table, past the candles Rachel had taught me to light every Christmas, past my son's face, which even now, even remembering it, I cannot fully describe, some mixture of defiance and the faintest flicker of a boy who knew, somewhere underneath all his practical talk, that he had crossed a line he could not uncross. I walked up my own staircase, the same staircase Nora had just climbed, and I found her in her bedroom, a small blue duffel bag open on her bed, folding a sweater with the kind of careful precision that broke my heart more than any tears could have. "Nora," I said from the doorway, and she did not turn around right away. She kept folding. "I'm almost done," she said, and her voice was so calm, so practiced, that I understood in that moment she had been rehearsing this exact scenario in her mind for longer than I wanted to know. "I'm packing light so it's easier to carry. I want Ethan to keep the bigger suitcase, in case he needs it for camp this summer." I want you to hear that sentence again. An 11-year-old girl, told by an adult she trusted that she did not belong to her own family, and her first thought, her very first instinct, was to make sure her brother's summer camp suitcase would still be available. That is the kind of child she was. That is the kind of child my son stood up and discarded over a turkey dinner. I crossed the room and I knelt down in front of her, my knees complaining the way they do now, and I put both my hands over her small hands, stilling them on top of the sweater she was folding. "Look at me," I said, and she did, finally, and I saw in her eyes something I will never forget for as long as I live, a kind of resigned exhaustion, a child who had already, at 11 years old, decided that being unwanted was simply a fact she would need to carry, the way some children carry asthma or a fear of dogs. "Where do you think you're going?" I asked her, as gently as I could manage with my heart still pounding from downstairs. "Wherever the girl who isn't blood is supposed to go," she said, and her voice cracked, finally, just slightly on the word blood, the first sign of the child underneath the composure. "I don't want Ethan to have to leave because of me. He's blood. He should get to stay with you. I just want him to be okay." I am going to tell you exactly what I said to her in that moment, because it is the truest thing I have ever said to another human being, and because I believe with everything in me that every child who has ever felt unwanted in their own family deserves to hear it said to them, even secondhand, even years later, even through a screen. "You listen to me," I told her, holding her small hands tighter. "You are not going anywhere, not tonight, not this week, not ever. Unless you decide, when you are a grown woman making your own choices, that you want to. Do you understand me? Nobody in this house, nobody at that table, nobody in this entire family has the authority to send you anywhere. And I am going to prove that to you on Monday, in a place where nobody gets to argue with the truth." She looked at me with a question in her eyes that she did not quite dare to ask, and I answered it before she could. 2 years ago, I told her, right after your mama and daddy went to heaven, I made sure of something. I made sure, in a way that no one in that dining room downstairs can undo with their opinions, that you and your brother would always, always have a home. And that home would always be with me, exactly the same way, exactly equally, for both of you. I didn't tell you because I never wanted you to have to carry the worry of it. But I promise you, Nora Rachel Ellison, you belong here every bit as much as your brother does. And on Monday, everyone downstairs is going to understand exactly what that means. She did not fully understand yet what I meant, and I did not explain it further that night, because some things a child needs to see proven rather than simply told. But she stopped folding. She sat down on the edge of her bed, still holding the blue duffel bag, and she let me hold her while she cried, finally, the tears she had refused to show at that table, the tears an 11-year-old girl had swallowed in front of 10 adults because some instinct in her had understood, correctly, that crying in that room would not have gotten her any sympathy. It would only have confirmed something for the people who wanted to see it confirmed. Downstairs, I could hear Daniel's voice rising, and Vanessa's, and my sister-in-law trying to smooth things over the way people always try to smooth things over at family gatherings, papering cracks that have already become canyons. I did not go back down right away. I sat on that bed with my granddaughter until her breathing slowed, until Ethan, tear-streaked and confused, appeared in the doorway and climbed onto the bed beside his sister without a word, the two of them leaning into each other the way they had leaned into each other at their parents' graveside 2 years earlier. And I understood, sitting there, that whatever happened next, whatever Monday brought, I was no longer simply protecting these children out of grief or obligation. I was protecting the last living proof that my son David had built something real, something that deserved to survive him, and I would not let anyone, not even his own brother, tear it apart at my dinner table. When I finally went back downstairs, the house had gone quiet in that particular brittle way houses go quiet after an explosion, when everyone is still standing in the wreckage, deciding whether to keep fighting or to pretend nothing happened. Daniel was standing by the window with his coat already on, Vanessa beside him with her purse clutched in both hands like a shield. "We're leaving," Daniel said, not quite meeting my eyes. "I think we all just need some time to cool off." "You need to hear something before you go," I told him, and something in my voice must have surprised him because he actually stopped moving toward the door and turned to look at me fully for the first time since he'd said those words at the table. "What you said to that child tonight was cruel. It was cruel, and it was also, as it happens, legally meaningless. And I am going to make sure you understand exactly why on Monday morning." Daniel stood there for a moment without moving at all, his hand still resting on the doorknob, and I watched something shift across his face. Confusion first, then something that looked almost like the beginning of alarm, though he tried, visibly, to smooth it back into the composed practicality he had worn like armor all evening. Behind him, through the sidelight window beside the front door, I could see the porch light catching the edge of the wreath I had hung there 3 weeks earlier, the same wreath Rachel had helped me choose from the Methodist Church's holiday sale the year before the accident, its red ribbon now a little faded from 2 winters of weather. And I remember thinking, in that strange, suspended moment, how odd it was that something so small and ordinary could still be hanging there, undisturbed, while everything inside the house it decorated had just come apart at the seams. Vanessa tugged gently at Daniel's sleeve, her voice dropping to a register meant to sound private, though it carried easily enough across the quiet hallway. "Let's just go, Dan," she said. "She's upset. We can sort all of this out after the holidays, when everyone's calmer." I want you to notice something in that sentence, because I certainly did, standing there. She did not say we were wrong. She did not say we should apologize. She said we should wait until everyone was calmer, as though calm alone would somehow dissolve the specific, deliberate cruelty of the words that had already been spoken. As though an 11-year-old girl folding a sweater into a duffel bag upstairs was simply an inconvenient mood that would pass with enough time and enough silence. Beth, still hovering near the coat closet with an armful of jackets she had gathered for departing guests, would not quite meet my eyes as she handed Frank his coat, and I understood, watching her, that she had already decided, in the particular way people decide these things without ever announcing it, that she would not be the one to say anything further tonight. I did not blame her for that either. Not everyone in a room is built to stand at the center of a confrontation, and there is a kind of quiet, complicit cowardice in families that I have come, over the years, to understand less as malice and more as a simple failure of imagination. An inability to picture what it might cost a child to have nobody speak up on her behalf in the exact moment it mattered most. "Mom," Daniel said, and his voice had softened slightly, though not, I noted, into anything resembling actual remorse, more into the practiced, placating tone he used to use as a teenager, whenever he sensed he had pushed an argument further than was strategically wise. "I don't want this to turn into a whole thing. I said what I said because somebody needed to be practical about the future. I don't think that makes me a monster." "I did not call you a monster," I told him, and I felt, saying it, how strange it was that my voice had gone so steady, so entirely without tremor, when only 20 minutes earlier I had been sitting frozen at my own table, unable to move a single muscle while my granddaughter walked out of the room. "I called what you said cruel. Those are different things, Daniel, and I would encourage you to spend some time this weekend understanding the difference, because I do not believe you fully do yet." He opened his mouth to answer, and then closed it again, glancing past me toward the staircase, toward the sound, faint but unmistakable, of a door easing shut somewhere above us. Nora's door, I realized, and I watched something flicker across my son's face that I could not fully name in that moment. Something that might, in a kinder version of this story, have been the beginning of shame. I did not trust it yet. I want to be honest about that. 2 years of small cruelties do not simply dissolve because a man's face changes shape for half a second in a hallway. And I had learned, by that Christmas, not to mistake a flicker of discomfort for genuine change. Eleanor stepped forward then, finally, from where she had been standing near the dining room doorway, and I remember the particular steel in her voice when she spoke. A steel I had not expected from a woman who had spent most of that dinner sitting quietly, with her hand resting on the stem of her wine glass. "Daniel," she said, "I have known you since you were 19 years old and dating my daughter's roommate at that dreadful apartment on Ash Street. I have never, in all these years, heard you say anything as ugly as what you said tonight. I hope, for your sake and for that little girl's sake, that whatever comes out of you on Monday is a great deal better than what came out of you tonight." Daniel did not answer her. He looked instead at some fixed point on the floor between us, and Vanessa, sensing the moment slipping further away from whatever version of this evening she had hoped to salvage, opened the front door herself, letting in a gust of cold December air that smelled faintly of wood smoke from somewhere down the street. I stood in that doorway, watching the porch light catch the fading ribbon on Rachel's wreath, watching my son's shoulders square themselves in that particular defensive posture I remembered from every difficult conversation of his adult life. And I understood, with a clarity that had been building in me for 2 solid years, that nothing I said to him in that hallway was going to undo what had already been done at that table. Words, I had learned slowly and at great cost, were not always the tool a moment like this one required. Sometimes what a moment required was simply the truth, arriving later, from somewhere he could not argue with, in a form he could not talk his way around. The room behind us had gone very still, the way a house goes still right before a storm breaks fully open, and I felt every eye in that hallway on the two of us, though I did not look away from my son's face to check. I heard Frank shift his weight near the coat closet, heard Eleanor's careful, measured breathing from where she still stood near the dining room doorway, and I understood, in that suspended moment, that I had just said something my son could not fully process, something that did not fit the version of this family he had walked in the door believing he still controlled. I want to tell you what passed through my mind in that pause, because I think it matters. I think it explains something about how a woman becomes capable of standing in her own front hallway and speaking to her son in a voice she barely recognized as her own. I thought, standing there, about the woman I had been for most of my life. The woman who apologized for things that were not her fault, who smoothed over arguments at family dinners rather than let them run their course, who had spent 31 years teaching other people's children to stand up for themselves while quietly failing, again and again, to model that same courage in her own home. That woman would have let Daniel's coat stay on. That woman would have said something conciliatory, something about how everyone was tired, how the holidays brought out old wounds, how we could all talk again after New Year's once tempers had cooled. That woman had died, I think, somewhere between the sound of Nora's feet on the staircase and the sight of that blue duffel bag open on her bed. And the woman standing in that hallway now, the one who had just told her son to clear his calendar, was someone new, or perhaps someone very old. Someone who had been waiting patiently inside me for exactly this occasion to finally step forward. I thought about the rainy Tuesday 2 years earlier, when I had first driven to Grace Whitfield's office, the wipers struggling against a downpour that had turned Route 9 into a river, my hands tight on the wheel the entire way, because some part of me had already understood that whatever I was about to do would change something permanent in the architecture of this family, whether or not anyone else ever found out about it. Her office had been small, tucked into the second floor of a converted Victorian house near the courthouse square, with a window that looked out over a parking lot and a single potted fern that had clearly seen better decades. I remembered sitting across from her desk, my purse in my lap, my coat still damp from the rain, feeling almost embarrassed to be there, as though seeking legal protection for two grieving children were some kind of admission of failure rather than an act of love. Grace had not made me feel that way. She had listened, taking notes in a careful, looping hand, and when I finished explaining what Vanessa had said at that first kitchen table meeting, she had set down her pen and looked at me with an expression I would come to recognize, over the following 2 years, as her particular brand of quiet, professional fury, the kind good attorneys learn to channel into precise, devastating paperwork rather than wasted emotion. "Mrs. Ellison," she had said to me that day, "I want you to understand that what you're describing is not uncommon, unfortunately. Families fracture along exactly these lines more often than people like to admit, especially after a loss like the one you've just suffered. Grief makes people territorial. It makes them start keeping score in ways they would be ashamed of in calmer times. The good news is that the law does not care about anyone's feelings on the matter. The law cares about documented, final, binding fact. And we can create that fact together, right now, before anyone else in your family has the chance to contest it." I remembered the home study that followed in the weeks after that meeting, the way Diane had walked through every room of my house with her clipboard, checking the smoke detectors in the hallway, opening the refrigerator to note that it was stocked with fresh food, asking to see where each child slept and whether they had their own space, their own belongings, their own sense of permanence within these walls. I remembered how nervous I had been that day, terrified in some small, irrational way that a stranger with a clipboard might find some flaw in my home, some evidence that a 66-year-old widow was not equal to the task of raising 2 grieving children alone. And I remembered the relief that had flooded through me when Diane finally sat down at my kitchen table, closed her folder, and told me, gently, that she had rarely seen a home study go this smoothly, that the children's attachment to me was, in her professional assessment, exactly what any child psychologist would hope to see in a family recovering from tragedy. I remembered, too, the particular ache of sitting in that same kitchen a week later, watching Nora do her homework at the table, while Ethan built an elaborate structure out of dried spaghetti and marshmallows for a school science project, and thinking, with a clarity that frightened me slightly, that I was quietly building a legal fortress around 2 children who had no idea it was being built, who trusted, with the easy, unguarded faith of the young, that the ground beneath them would simply continue to hold. I had wanted, more than almost anything in my life up to that point, for that trust to remain justified, without them ever needing to understand exactly how much careful, deliberate work had gone into making it so. And I thought, standing in that hallway with my son's coat already buttoned and his wife's purse clutched like a shield, about the drive Rachel had made through a snowstorm nearly 12 years earlier. The story she had told me so many times, I could recite it in her exact cadence. The way she had gotten the phone call from her sister Callie at 11 o'clock at night and had not even waited for morning, had simply put on her boots and driven 4 hours through whiteout conditions on roads the state police were actively telling people to avoid, because some instinct in her, some fierce, immovable certainty, told her that the infant on the other end of that phone call needed her more than the weather needed to be obeyed. David had told me once, years after, that when Rachel finally walked through their front door that night, snow melting in her hair, a car seat balanced on one hip. She had looked at him and said only, "This is our daughter now." Not as a question, not as a request for his agreement, but as a fact already settled in her heart before she had even finished the drive home. David had never once, not for a single day of his marriage, treated that fact as anything less than absolute. It had taken his own brother, standing in my dining room 2 years after David's death, to suggest otherwise. And I understood, in that hallway, exactly how much of my fury in that moment was not really about Daniel at all. It was about defending a decision Rachel had made in a snowstorm, a decision my son had honored with his whole heart for the rest of his short life, a decision that deserved, at minimum, to survive both of their deaths intact. I looked at Daniel's face in that hallway, and I saw, underneath the defensive set of his jaw, something I had not let myself see clearly in 2 years of quiet documentation. Something that made this entire situation sadder than simple cruelty alone could explain. I saw a man who had lost his older brother, the person he had spent his entire childhood measuring himself against, and who had never once, in 2 years, been given the space or the permission to grieve that loss on its own terms, separate from the practical, immediate demands of 2 orphaned children who needed care right away. I do not say this to excuse him. I want to be entirely clear with you about that. Nothing in Daniel's grief entitled him to say what he said at that table, in front of that child, on that particular holiday. But I understood, standing in that hallway, that grief left unspoken and unexamined does not simply disappear. It curdles. It finds smaller, uglier shapes to live inside. And if a family does not make room for a person to grieve honestly, that person will sometimes, eventually, grieve dishonestly instead. And someone innocent will pay the price for it. None of that understanding, I want to be clear, softened what I intended to do on Monday. Compassion for the wound does not require tolerance for the wound's consequences, and I had learned that particular lesson, slowly and at great cost, over the previous 2 years of watching small cruelties accumulate unchecked in the name of family peace. I had given Daniel 2 years of quiet grace, 2 years of biting my tongue at Thanksgiving, 2 years of hoping time alone would do the work that direct confrontation should have done far sooner. That grace period, I understood now, standing in my own front hallway with my coat-buttoned son waiting for my next words, had officially and permanently expired the moment those 8 words left his mouth in front of an 11-year-old girl holding a fork. Eleanor moved slightly near the dining room doorway, and I heard the soft rustle of her cardigan, and I glanced at her for just a moment, saw the same fierce, protective grief in her expression that I imagined must have lived in Rachel's face the night she drove through that snowstorm. And I understood that whatever happened next, whatever Monday finally revealed to this fractured family, I was not standing alone in that hallway, even though it was only my voice speaking. I carried 2 years of quiet preparation behind every word, and I intended, finally, after everything, to let my son hear the full weight of it. "What is that supposed to mean?" Daniel said, an edge of nervousness cutting through his earlier bravado for just a flicker of a second, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "It means," I said, and here I paused, because I wanted him to feel the full weight of what I was about to say, "that you don't have the authority you seem to think you have. You never did. And on Monday, you're going to sit in a room and hear exactly how little authority that is, from someone whose job it is to say so." Daniel's face did something complicated in that moment. a flicker of confusion trying to fight through his anger. And I watched him decide, the way he always decided things, to push forward rather than to ask the question that might have given him useful information. "Whatever, Mom. I don't know what you think you're threatening me with, but this family needs to have a real conversation about what's fair, about what's practical. And I'm not going to apologize for bringing it up just because everyone wants to pretend it isn't a real issue." "There is no conversation to have," I said quietly now, because I had learned somewhere over the last 2 years that quiet, delivered correctly, cuts far deeper than shouting ever could. "There is only Monday. I would suggest you clear your calendar." They left without another word, Vanessa pulling their own 2 children, my other grandchildren, out into the cold night with barely a goodbye to Ethan and Nora, who stood at the top of the stairs watching them go, Ethan's hand tucked into his sister's the way it had been since he learned to walk. I stood at that door for a long time after their car pulled out of the driveway, watching the taillights disappear down the street, feeling something settle in my chest that was not quite peace and not quite anger, but some third thing, something like resolve, finally crystallizing after 2 years of quiet preparation. That night, after both children were finally asleep, curled together in Nora's room because neither one wanted to sleep alone, I went down to my study and I opened the bottom drawer of my desk. I took out the manila folder, its edges soft now from 2 years of sitting undisturbed beneath old warranty cards, and I laid the guardianship order out on my desk under the lamplight, reading it again for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit. Permanent legal guardian of Ethan David Ellison and Nora Rachel Ellison, both minors, effective immediately, superseding any prior informal arrangement. Judge Renata Cole's signature at the bottom, firm and unhurried. The signature of a woman who had signed 1,000 documents like this one and understood the weight each one carried. I sat there a long time with that piece of paper in front of me, thinking about David, about the daffodils along the church walkway the day we buried him, about Rachel driving 4 hours through a snowstorm to bring home a baby who was never, not for one single day of her life, anything less than wanted. I thought about the promise I had made at that graveside, my hands on the shoulders of 2 shaking children, and I understood, sitting in that lamplight at nearly midnight, that the promise had brought me here, to this exact folder, on this exact desk, 2 years in advance of the moment I would need it most. I had not known, when I sat in Grace Whitfield's office that rainy Tuesday, exactly what shape the danger would eventually take. I had only known there would be danger, and that a mother who loves her grandchildren does not wait for the wolf to arrive before she builds the fence. I called Grace Whitfield first thing the next morning, a Saturday, apologizing for the early hour, and I told her everything that had happened at the table the night before. There was a long pause on her end of the line before she spoke, and when she did, her voice had a particular steadiness to it, the voice of a professional who has seen families tear themselves apart over exactly this kind of poison before and has learned not to be surprised by it, only prepared for it. "Margaret," she said, "I want you to listen to me carefully. Nothing your son said at that table changes anything about the legal reality. Your guardianship order is final. It was granted 2 years ago. It is not up for renegotiation at a dinner table. And frankly, it is not up for renegotiation anywhere unless someone files a formal petition to modify it, which would require them to prove, in front of a judge, that removing Nora from your care was somehow in her best interest. Does that sound like something your son could prove? No, I said. And for the first time since the previous night, something loosened in my chest. Then here is what I want you to understand, Grace said. You don't need to fight your son. You don't need to argue with him or convince him or win him over. The law already did that work for you 2 years ago when Judge Cole signed that order. All you need to do now is let the truth stand where it already stands, and let him discover, in a room where his opinions carry no legal weight at all, exactly how little power his words at that table actually had. There's a hearing scheduled for Monday, I told her, remembering suddenly the annual review notice that had come in the mail 2 weeks earlier, a routine formality I had almost forgotten in the chaos of the holiday. A standard check-in the court required once a year to confirm the guardianship remained appropriate and the children remained well cared for. It was already on the calendar before any of this happened. Would it be possible for you to be there? Would it be possible for the judge to, I don't know, make it very clear to my son exactly where things stand? Grace was quiet for a moment, and then I heard something in her voice that I had not expected, something almost like anticipation. Margaret, she said, I have been doing this work for 26 years. I have watched a great many families do a great many cruel things to children who did not deserve it. It would be my genuine pleasure to be in that courtroom on Monday morning. I hung up the phone and sat for a long moment in my kitchen, morning light coming pale through the window over the sink. The same window where I had washed dishes every night for 2 years while Ethan did his homework at the table, and Nora practiced her spelling words out loud, insisting I quiz her even when she already knew every one. I thought about how close I had come, in the panic of that first year after the accident, to simply trusting that family would behave like family, that love would be enough to hold everyone in the right shape, without anything written down, without anything filed, without anything signed under a judge's careful hand. I was deeply, profoundly grateful, in that quiet kitchen, that some instinct in me 2 years earlier had refused to trust in love alone. Love, I have learned, is essential. But love without protection is a house with no locks on the doors. And I had learned that lesson from a man who was supposed to have been raised better than to test it. The 2 days between that Christmas dinner and the Monday hearing passed in a strange, suspended quiet. I did not call Daniel, and he did not call me, though Vanessa sent one text message on Saturday afternoon that I read 3 times before deciding not to respond to it at all. It said simply, "We just want what's fair for everyone." And I remember staring at those words for a long time, marveling at how a person could convince herself that discarding a grieving 11-year-old girl in front of her whole family constituted fairness. I did not respond, not out of spite, but because I understood, finally, after 2 years of trying to reason with people who had already decided what they wanted to believe, that some conversations are not meant to be had in text messages. Some conversations are meant to be had in courtrooms, under oath, in front of a judge who does not care how charming or how practical you believe yourself to be. I spent Saturday and Sunday instead doing something far more important than arguing with my son. I spent it with my grandchildren. We made cinnamon rolls from the recipe Rachel used to make every Christmas morning, the one written in her looping handwriting on an index card I keep taped inside my kitchen cabinet. Nora measured the flour with the careful precision she brought to everything, and Ethan made a spectacular mess of the cinnamon sugar. And for 2 hours, standing in my kitchen with flour on our hands and Rachel's handwriting propped up against the sugar canister, none of us talked about what had happened at that table. We simply were a family, uninterrupted, the way we had been every single day for 2 years, the way I intended for us to remain for as long as I had breath in my body to make sure of it. On Sunday evening, after the children were in bed, I sat down with a legal pad and I did something I had not done since my teaching days, something that felt, in the moment, almost absurdly familiar. I made a list. Not a list of grievances, though God knows I could have filled several pages with those. I made a list of what I wanted Monday to accomplish, beyond the simple legal fact of the guardianship order standing firm. I wanted my grandchildren to hear, out loud, in a room with real authority behind it, that they belonged to each other and to me in a way that no dinner table opinion could ever touch. I wanted Daniel to hear it too. Not to punish him exactly, though I will admit some part of me wanted precisely that. But because I still held, somewhere beneath the anger, a flicker of hope that hearing the truth stated plainly by someone with real authority might finally do what 2 years of quiet hurt had failed to do. It might wake something up in him. I called my old friend Patricia, who I had known since our own children were small, a woman with a steel spine and a soft heart in exactly the right proportions, and I asked her if she would come with me on Monday, simply to sit beside me, simply to be a presence in that room who loved these children without a single asterisk attached to that love. She agreed before I had even finished asking. I called Diane, the social worker who had done the original home study 2 years earlier and who had, in the time since, become something like a friend, checking in every few months just to see how the children were doing. And I told her what had happened at Christmas dinner. There was a long silence on her end of the line, and when she finally spoke, her voice was tight with a controlled kind of anger I had not heard from her before. "Margaret," she said, "would you be comfortable if I attended Monday's hearing as well? Not as a witness necessarily, though I would testify if asked. Simply as someone who has seen firsthand over 2 years exactly how those children have thrived in your care, together, as siblings, exactly as they should be." I told her I would be more than comfortable. I told her, in fact, that I would be grateful beyond what words could properly express. I did not sleep well Sunday night, not because I feared what Monday would bring, but because I kept replaying, over and over, the sound of my granddaughter's small feet on the staircase, the sight of that blue duffel bag open on her bed, the careful, practiced way she had folded her clothes so that Ethan could keep the larger suitcase for summer camp. I thought about every version of this story that plays out differently across this country. In families where no grandmother sat quietly in an attorney's office 2 years earlier, where no manila folder waited in a desk drawer, where a child packs a bag and there is no one standing at the door to stop her. I thought about how close I had come, myself, to being one more grandmother who trusted love to be enough, and I said a quiet prayer of gratitude, lying awake in the dark, that some stubborn, suspicious part of me had refused to trust in that alone. I got out of bed a little after midnight and walked down the hallway to check on the children, the old habit of a mother who has buried too many people not to feel the pull toward small, reassuring proof that everyone under her roof is still breathing safely in the dark. Nora's door was cracked open, the way it always was, so Ethan could see the hallway light from his own room next door. And I found her sitting up against her pillows, wide awake, her knees drawn to her chest, staring at nothing in particular. "Can't sleep either," I said softly, and she shook her head, and I came and sat on the edge of her bed, the same edge where she had sat holding that blue duffel bag 2 nights earlier. And for a while, neither of us said anything at all. The house was quiet, in that particular way houses are quiet at midnight, the furnace ticking somewhere below us, the wind pushing softly against the window glass. And I found myself thinking, sitting there in the dark beside her, about how much silence this child had already learned to carry gracefully in her short life. Silence at the graveside. Silence at that dinner table. Silence now, in a bedroom at midnight, when any ordinary 11-year-old should have been dreaming about nothing more complicated than a snow day. "Grandma," she finally said, "what if the judge doesn't say what you think she's going to say?" I want to be honest with you about how that question landed in my chest, because it was the exact fear I had been holding at bay all weekend, tucked carefully behind my composure, the way you tuck away anything too dangerous to look at directly for too long. I did not lie to her. I had promised myself, sitting in that same hallway 2 nights earlier, that I would never again let a comfortable silence stand in for a hard truth in this house, not even to spare a child a moment's worry. "I don't think there's any real question about what the judge is going to say," I told her carefully, "because the law already settled this 2 years ago, before your uncle ever said a word at that table. But I want you to understand something else. Something that matters even more than what happens in that courtroom tomorrow. Whatever the judge says, whatever anyone in that room decides, you are still my granddaughter. You are still Ethan's sister. That was true before any court order existed, and it will still be true no matter what any piece of paper says. The paper is just there to make sure nobody else in this family ever gets to pretend otherwise again." She considered that for a long moment, turning it over the way she turned over every serious thing I ever told her. And then she asked me something I had not expected, something that told me exactly how carefully she had been listening to every quiet conversation in this house for the last 2 years. Without ever once letting on how much she understood. "Is that why you went to see that lawyer, Mrs. Whitfield?" "I saw her name on an envelope once, in your desk, when I was looking for tape. I felt my breath catch slightly, and then, strangely, I felt something close to relief. The relief of no longer having to decide, alone, whether the moment had finally arrived to tell her." "Yes," I said. "That's exactly why. 2 years ago, after everything happened with your mama and daddy, I wanted to make absolutely certain that no matter what anyone in this family ever said or did, you and your brother would always, always have a home that nobody could take away from you. So I went and I made it official, in a court, with a judge, so it would never just be my word against anyone else's opinion." "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked, not accusingly, simply curious, the way children ask the questions adults spend years working up the courage to ask each other. "Because I hoped you would never need to know it existed," I told her honestly. "I hoped, foolishly maybe, that if I just loved you both enough, out loud, every single day, nobody would ever test it. I think I was wrong about that. I think maybe you both deserved to know, all along, exactly how solid the ground under your feet really was. I'm sorry it took your uncle saying something so cruel for me to finally tell you." Nora was quiet again, and then she reached over and took my hand, her fingers small and cool against mine, and she said, in a voice that was trying very hard to sound braver than an 11-year-old sitting up in bed at midnight has any obligation to sound, "I'm glad you did it anyway, even if you never told us. I think part of me always kind of knew you would do something like that. You're that kind of grandma. I do not think I have ever, in my entire life, received a compliment that undid me quite as completely as that one did, sitting on the edge of her bed in the dark." I stayed with her until her breathing finally slowed and evened out into sleep, and then I sat a while longer, watching her, thinking about everything that had brought us to this exact moment, this exact bedroom, this exact fragile, hard-won peace. I did not know it yet, sitting there in the dark, but something had already been set in motion 2 nights before, on Christmas night itself. Late that Friday night, hours after Daniel drove home from that dinner, he was awake in his own house across town, on the phone with a law school friend named Mitch he had not spoken to in almost a decade, describing the situation in the careful, self-justifying language of a man building a case for himself in his own mind before he ever thought to build one anywhere else. I learned the details of that call much later, from Vanessa herself, in a conversation neither of us expected to have, and I have thought about it often since, because it explains so much about what happened in that courtroom on Monday morning. Mitch, according to what Vanessa eventually told me, had listened to Daniel's version of events, the practical concerns, the biological argument, the framing of the whole matter as a fair and reasonable family conversation about long-term planning, and had then told him, bluntly, that he was almost certainly wasting his time and possibly making things considerably worse for himself. "If your mother already has a guardianship order," Mitch had apparently said, "signed and finalized 2 years ago, there's no informal family conversation that touches that. You'd need to file a formal petition to modify guardianship, and you'd need to prove, with real evidence, that the current arrangement is actively harmful to the child. Do you have anything like that, Dan? Anything at all?" Daniel, by Vanessa's account, had gone quiet on the phone for a long moment before admitting that he did not, that his concerns were, in the end, mostly about fairness and biology, and what he believed, in some vague, undefined way, the family ought to look like going forward. Mitch had apparently laughed, not unkindly, but with the particular weary disbelief of a man who has spent his career watching families destroy themselves over things far smaller than what he was hearing described to him. "Dan," he had said, "I love you, but that's not a legal argument. That's just an opinion you had at Christmas dinner. A judge is going to eat you alive if you try to bring that into a courtroom without anything behind it." And yet, and this is the part that still, even now, tells me almost everything I need to know about the particular kind of stubbornness that had taken root in my son over the previous 2 years. Daniel had filed the request to be heard at Monday's hearing anyway, first thing Saturday morning, less than 12 hours after that phone call, driven by some combination of wounded pride and a genuine, if badly misguided, belief that if he simply stood up and said his piece in front of a judge, in front of the whole family, someone would finally have to take his side. He had not consulted an attorney of his own. He had not gathered a single piece of evidence. He had simply filled out a form at the courthouse clerk's window, using the language of fairness and long-term planning, and had gone home to tell Vanessa, with what she described to me later as genuine confidence, that Monday was going to be the day the family finally had, quote, "the real conversation nobody had been brave enough to have yet." I did not know any of this, sitting beside my sleeping granddaughter that Sunday midnight. I only knew what I could control, which was the folder in my desk drawer, the friends who had agreed to stand beside me, and the truth that had already been settled, quietly, 2 years earlier, waiting patiently for whatever storm my son intended to bring into that courtroom. I finally went to bed myself sometime after 1 in the morning, and I lay awake a long while longer, staring at the ceiling of the bedroom I had shared with my late husband for 39 years before cancer took him, thinking about how strange it was that grief kept arriving in this family in waves, each one reshaping the shoreline a little differently, and how the only thing that seemed to hold steady through all of it was the stubborn, unglamorous work of preparation, the manila folders and home studies and quiet phone calls to old friends, the unremarkable architecture of love made durable enough to survive whatever came next. I thought about Rachel, and about David, and about the daffodils along the church walkway, And I said, somewhere in the dark, a version of the same prayer I had been saying for 2 years, that whatever happened in that courtroom the next morning, these 2 children would walk out of it knowing, finally and completely, exactly where they belonged. I woke before my alarm, the way I almost always did on days that mattered, and I lay there for a moment in the gray, pre-dawn light, listening to the house settle around me, before I got up and went downstairs to put on the coffee and lay out breakfast, wanting, more than anything, for this particular morning to begin the way every ordinary morning in this house had begun for the last 2 years, with oatmeal and cinnamon, and the small, steady rituals that told 2 grieving children, without a single word being spoken, that they were safe. I called Grace Whitfield one final time while the coffee brewed, mostly to steady my own nerves, and she answered on the second ring, already awake, already, I suspected, reviewing her notes for the morning ahead. "Everything's in order, Margaret," she told me, and I could hear the quiet, controlled confidence in her voice. The voice of a woman who had spent 26 years learning exactly how to walk into a courtroom and let the truth do the heaviest lifting. "The order is final. The file is complete. All you need to do today is exactly what you've been doing for 2 years already. Show up and let the record speak for itself." I thanked her, and I hung up the phone, and I stood for a moment in my kitchen in the pale, early light, looking at the index card taped inside the cabinet in Rachel's looping handwriting. And I understood that whatever else this day held, I had already done the hardest part of the work a long time ago, quietly, without applause, in a small office above a courthouse square on a rainy Tuesday, 2 years before anyone else in this family had thought to ask what would happen if love alone were not enough. Monday morning arrived cold and clear, the kind of bright winter sunlight that makes everything look sharper than it is, edges more defined, shadows more certain. I dressed the children carefully, not in anything elaborate, simply in clean, comfortable clothes, because I did not want this day to feel to them like a performance. I wanted it to feel like what it actually was, a simple confirmation of a truth that had already been settled 2 years earlier. A formality with teeth. Ethan was quiet in the car, watching the winter fields pass outside the window, and Nora sat beside him with her hand resting lightly on his knee, the way she had held his hand at their parents' graveside, the way she had held it every difficult moment since. An 11-year-old already fluent in the particular language of steadying someone smaller and more frightened than herself. "Grandma," Nora said as we pulled into the courthouse parking lot, "is Uncle Daniel going to be there?" "Yes," I told her honestly, because I had promised myself, somewhere in the last 2 days, that I would never again let this family's silence around hard truths be the thing that hurt these children. "He's going to be there, but I want you to understand something, and I want you to hear it clearly before we walk inside. Nothing that happens in that room today depends on what your Uncle Daniel thinks or says or wants. This is not about convincing him of anything. This is simply about the truth being spoken out loud, in a place where the truth has the final word." She was quiet for a moment, studying my face with the careful attention she brought to everything, and then she nodded, slowly, and I watched something settle in her shoulders, some small portion of the weight she had been carrying since Friday night finally easing. Ethan reached over and took her hand again, without being asked, the way he always did, and the 2 of them walked into that courthouse together, side by side, exactly as they had walked through every hard day of the last 2 years. The courthouse itself was an unremarkable building, brick and glass, built sometime in the 70s, with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly tired, and a security checkpoint manned by an officer who winked at Ethan and told him he liked his sneakers. Grace Whitfield was waiting for us in the lobby, a folder of her own tucked under one arm, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a knot that somehow managed to look both practical and formidable at once. Patricia arrived moments later, and Diane not long after, and I felt, standing there in that unremarkable lobby, surrounded by the people who had chosen, freely and without obligation, to stand beside these children, something I had not expected to feel that morning. I felt less alone than I had felt in 2 years. Daniel and Vanessa arrived just before the hearing was set to begin, and I watched my son's face as he walked into that lobby and saw the small gathering assembled around me. Watched something flicker across his features that I recognized, even then, as the first true understanding that this was not going to unfold the way he had imagined it would. He was dressed in a suit, the same navy suit he wore to church on Easter, and Vanessa wore pearls, and I understood, watching them, that they had dressed for a negotiation, for a conversation in which their opinions would be weighed and considered, and, they clearly still believed, ultimately respected. They had not yet understood that there was no negotiation scheduled. There was only a reading. "Mom," Daniel said, approaching me with an expression that was trying very hard to look reasonable, "I want you to know I'm not trying to be the villain here. I've had 2 days to think about this, and I still believe there are things worth discussing, calmly, like adults, about what's actually fair for everyone long-term." "There's a courtroom waiting," I told him, and I did not raise my voice because I had learned, somewhere in the last 2 years, that the coldest, most devastating things a person can say are usually said very quietly. "You'll have every opportunity to say whatever you believe needs saying, Daniel. I would simply encourage you to listen first." We were called into the courtroom not long after, a smaller room than I had expected, wood paneling and a modest gallery of chairs. Judge Renata Cole, already seated behind the bench reviewing a file when we filed in, her silver hair pulled back exactly as I remembered it from 2 years earlier, her expression composed and unreadable in the particular way of someone who has spent decades learning not to react visibly to the things families do to one another. Ethan and Nora sat between Patricia and me in the gallery, Diane a row behind, Grace Whitfield seated at the small table reserved for counsel, and across the aisle, Daniel and Vanessa sat stiffly upright, whispering to each other in low, anxious tones. Judge Cole called the case, reading the docket number aloud in the flat, practiced cadence of someone who has read 1,000 docket numbers before this one. And then she looked up, her eyes moving across the room, settling briefly on the children before returning to the file in front of her. "This is a scheduled annual review," she said, "of the permanent guardianship order issued by this court on March 14th, granting Margaret Ellison sole legal guardianship of the minors Ethan David Ellison and Nora Rachel Ellison." She paused, glancing again at the file. "I see a request was also submitted, quite recently, by a Mr. Daniel Ellison, seeking to be heard on a matter related to this guardianship. Mr. Ellison, would you like to address the court?" Daniel rose to his feet, straightening his suit jacket, and I watched him take a breath, watched him find, somewhere in himself, the same confidence that had carried him through Christmas dinner. "Yes, Your Honor, thank you. I've had some concerns recently about the long-term arrangement for my niece and nephew, specifically regarding my niece Nora, who is not biologically related to our family. I understand my mother has cared for them well. I want to be clear about that. But I believe going forward it may be more appropriate, and frankly more sustainable, for the family to consider separate arrangements based on each child's actual biological connection to our family line." There was a silence in that courtroom after he said it, a silence I recognized immediately, because it was the same silence that had fallen over my dinner table 3 nights earlier. That particular, suffocating quiet that settles over a room when someone has said something so plainly cruel that even the people inclined to agree cannot quite bring themselves to nod along out loud. Judge Cole did not move for a long moment. She simply looked at Daniel, her expression unchanging, and then she looked down at the file in front of her. And when she spoke again, her voice had shifted into something colder, something with an edge I had not heard in it during our first hearing 2 years earlier. "Mr. Ellison," she said, "I want to make sure I understand you correctly. You are suggesting that this court should consider removing an 11-year-old child from the only home and family she has known for the last 2 years, a home in which, according to the file in front of me, she has demonstrated, and I am reading directly here, strong, secure attachment, excellent academic performance, and no indicators of instability whatsoever, on the basis that her adoption predates her connection to this particular family by biological accident rather than biological design." "I wouldn't put it exactly like that, Your Honor," Daniel said, and I could hear, for the first time, a genuine crack of uncertainty in his voice. "How would you put it?" Judge Cole asked, and it was not really a question. It was an invitation to hear himself clearly, perhaps for the first time. Daniel did not answer right away. Vanessa shifted in her seat beside him, and I watched my son's jaw work silently for a moment, and I understood, watching him, that some part of him had genuinely not expected this reaction, had genuinely believed, walking into that courtroom, that his practical concerns would be received as practical concerns rather than as the cruelty they actually were. There is a particular kind of person who can say a devastating thing at a dinner table, surrounded by people too shocked or too polite to challenge him, and never once be forced to hear his own words reflected back with the weight they actually carry. A courtroom, I was learning, does not extend that same mercy. The silence that followed stretched on longer than any silence I had endured yet that week, longer even than the one that had swallowed my dining room on Christmas night. And I understood, sitting there with Nora's hand still folded inside mine, that this particular silence was doing something the one at my table had never managed to do. It was forcing my son to sit inside his own words without anyone rushing in to soften them for him. Nobody in that gallery cleared a throat. Nobody shifted a chair. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to hum a little quieter. Or perhaps I simply noticed everything more sharply in those seconds, the way you notice the smallest details of a room in the instant before something important is about to happen. I watched Daniel's hands, because I could not quite bring myself to keep watching his face. He had his father's hands, my late husband's hands, wide-knuckled and capable, and I remembered those exact hands wrapped around a plastic bat in our backyard 3 decades earlier, 7 years old and furious that his older brother had struck him out twice in a row. And I remembered thinking, even then, watching him kick at the dirt rather than accept a fair call, that my younger son had never quite learned how to lose gracefully in front of an audience. He had learned, instead, to argue the call, to insist the pitch had been outside the zone, to keep talking until someone, usually his brother, simply let him win the argument out of exhaustion rather than agreement. I understood, watching him stand frozen in that courtroom now, a grown man in a navy suit with nothing left to argue his way out of, that he had never once, in 41 years, been placed in a room where that particular strategy simply did not work. Vanessa reached over and touched his sleeve, a small, anxious gesture, and I watched her lean toward him and whisper something too quiet for the rest of us to hear, though I could guess well enough at its shape from the way Daniel's jaw tightened further in response. I imagined she was telling him to say something, anything, to fill the silence before the judge filled it for him, because Vanessa had never, in the 2 years I had known her as my daughter-in-law, been comfortable inside a quiet room. She filled silences the way some people fill glasses, compulsively, without always considering whether the silence had actually needed filling in the first place. But Daniel did not speak. I think in that moment, some part of him had finally understood that anything he said next would only dig the hole he was standing in a little deeper. And for perhaps the first time in his adult life, he chose silence over argument, though I do not believe it was wisdom that led him there, so much as simple, total loss for words. Grace Whitfield sat perfectly still at the counsel table beside me, her hands folded on top of the closed folder in front of her. And I understood, watching her, that she had seen this exact moment play out in courtrooms many times before. The moment when a person who has spent their whole life getting away with careless cruelty finally encounters a room that will not let them. She did not smile. I want to be clear about that, because I do not want you to think this story is about anyone taking pleasure in my son's humiliation. Grace's expression remained composed, professional, patient. The expression of a woman who understood that her job was not to enjoy this moment, but simply to make sure the truth arrived exactly where it needed to go, without obstruction, without apology. I looked down at Ethan, sitting beside me on the other side from Nora, and I saw that he had gone very still, his eyes wide, watching his uncle with an expression I recognized immediately, because I had seen a version of it on his own father's face many years earlier, whenever David had watched his younger brother dig in on some argument he could not possibly win. Ethan did not fully understand, I think, the legal weight of what was happening in that room, the finer distinctions between a guardianship order and an informal family opinion, the difference between a legally finalized adoption and a biological accident of birth. But he understood, in the way children always understand far more than adults give them credit for, that his uncle had been caught in something, that the room had turned against the version of events Daniel had walked in believing. And I watched my grandson's small hand tighten slightly around the edge of his chair, bracing, the way children brace themselves whenever the adults around them begin to unravel in ways they cannot fully name. I thought, in that stretched, ringing silence, about something Diane had told me once, months after the original home study, sitting in my kitchen over coffee she actually did drink. She had told me that in 20 years of social work, she had come to believe that most cruelty inside families was not, in fact, driven by hatred at all. It was driven by fear, dressed up as practicality, dressed up as fairness, dressed up as simply speaking an uncomfortable truth nobody else was brave enough to name. People convince themselves they're the reasonable one, she had said, stirring sugar into her cup, right up until the moment someone with real authority asks them to explain their reasoning out loud, in front of witnesses, without the comfort of an audience too polite to push back. That's usually when the whole argument falls apart, because it was never built on reasoning in the first place. It was built on fear. And fear doesn't hold up well under direct questioning. I understood, sitting in that gallery watching my son fail to answer a simple, direct question from a woman in a black robe, exactly how right Diane had been. Daniel was not evil. I want to be careful telling you this story, not to make him into a cartoon villain, because I do not believe that would be honest, and I promised myself I would tell this story honestly. He was afraid of being forgotten, afraid of being less important now that his older brother's memory occupied so much space in this family's grief. Afraid, perhaps most of all, of a future in which he had no clear, defined role to play, no obvious way to matter. He had built an argument out of that fear, dressed it up in the language of blood and biology and long-term planning, and had carried it all the way into a courtroom, believing it would hold. It did not hold. I watched it collapse in real time, in the space of one simple, unanswerable question. And I felt, watching it happen, not triumph exactly, but something closer to a very old, very tired grief finally being allowed to surface after 2 years of careful containment. Judge Cole waited. She did not rush him, and she did not fill the silence for him either. And I understood, watching her patient, unhurried expression, that she had learned, over 26 years on that bench, precisely how much information a silence like this one could reveal, if you simply had the discipline to let it stretch as long as it needed to stretch. Some judges, I imagine, would have moved things along, offered Daniel an easier question, allowed him some graceful exit from the corner he had backed himself into. Judge Renata Cole was not that kind of judge, and I have never, in the years since, stopped being grateful for that particular quality in her. I glanced once at Patricia, seated on my other side, and found her watching Daniel with an expression of controlled, quiet disappointment that reminded me, oddly, of the exact expression she used to wear at parent-teacher conferences decades earlier, back when our children were still small and occasionally disappointing in far more ordinary ways. She caught my eye and gave the smallest shake of her head. Not quite a comment, more an acknowledgement passing silently between two old friends who had known each other's families long enough to recognize exactly how far a person's worst moment could sometimes travel from who you had always hoped they would become. I thought of Frank's voice at my own dinner table 3 nights earlier, the single thread of decency thrown too late across that first frozen silence, and I understood that this courtroom, unlike my dining room, was not going to let the moment pass without consequence. There would be no polite refilling of wine glasses here, no quiet agreement among the family to simply move past what had been said. There would only be the record, plain and permanent, of exactly what my son had chosen to say, and exactly how little he had been able to say in his own defense once someone finally asked him to explain it. I felt Nora's hand tighten slightly in mine, and I looked down to find her watching her uncle with an expression that was not triumphant either. Not exactly, though I understood, watching her, that some old, aching part of her had needed to witness exactly this moment, needed to see a grown man who had called her a girl who wasn't theirs stand frozen and speechless in front of a room that had finally, unmistakably, refused to let him get away with it. I do not think an 11-year-old girl should ever have to need a moment like that. I think, in a fairer world, no child would ever be made to sit through a Christmas dinner where her belonging was debated aloud. And no courtroom moment, however satisfying, could ever fully undo the fact that it had happened at all. But I also believe, watching my granddaughter's face in that silence, that something important was being restored to her in that room, something no apology delivered later in a hallway could have restored quite as completely. She was watching the truth win, cleanly, without argument, without anyone needing to soften it for the comfort of the people who had gotten it wrong. Mr. Ellison, Judge Cole continued, when it became clear he did not intend to answer, I want to be very clear with you, and with everyone in this room, about the legal reality we are operating under. The guardianship order granted to Margaret Ellison 2 years ago made no distinction, none whatsoever, between the legal standing of these 2 children. Nora Rachel Ellison's adoption by her late father and mother was finalized in a court of law, witnessed, recorded, and legally binding in every possible sense. She is not, under the law of this state, or under any reasonable understanding of family, less connected to this family than her brother. The idea that a family gathering, or a personal opinion expressed at a holiday dinner could somehow override a legally finalized adoption and a court-ordered guardianship is not simply incorrect, Mr. Ellison. It is, frankly, a fantasy. I watched Nora, beside me, sit up slightly straighter at those words, watched something shift in her posture, and I reached over and took her hand, holding it the way I had held it 100 times over the last 2 years. But this time, I think, she felt something different in the grip. This time, I think, she felt the truth of what I had told her Friday night finally becoming real in front of her. Spoken not by her grandmother, who loved her and might therefore be dismissed as biased, but by a stranger in a black robe whose entire job was to weigh only the facts. Furthermore, Judge Cole continued, and I heard something in her voice sharpen even further, I want to address the timing of your petition, Mr. Ellison. My clerk informs me that you filed a request to be heard at this hearing on Saturday morning, less than 48 hours after, and I am quoting from your mother's affidavit here, you announced at a family Christmas dinner that your niece should be, and again I am quoting directly, quote, sent back, unquote, because, quote, the girl isn't ours, unquote. Is that an accurate account of what was said at that dinner, Mr. Ellison? Daniel's face had gone pale, a color I had genuinely never seen on him before, not even at his brother's funeral. I may have said something along those lines, Your Honor, but I was upset. It was said in the heat of a family conversation. I don't think it's fair to hold every word said at a private family dinner to a legal standard. I am not holding it to a legal standard, Mr. Ellison, Judge Cole said. I am holding it to a human one. You said those words in front of an 11-year-old child. You said them at a dinner table, in front of her 9-year-old brother, in front of your own mother, on a holiday that I understand this family has observed together every year since these children lost their parents. I do not need a legal standard to recognize cruelty when it is read into the record in front of me. I simply need my own 2 ears. The courtroom was silent again, and this time, the silence had a different quality to it entirely. Not the suffocating quiet of Christmas night, but something almost like relief, like a held breath finally being released. I glanced at Grace Whitfield, and she gave me the smallest, most controlled nod. The nod of a professional watching a case unfold exactly as she had hoped it would. And I glanced at Diane, whose eyes had gone bright with something between anger and vindication. And I glanced, finally, at Vanessa, whose pearls suddenly looked less like armor and more like a costume for a role she was no longer sure she wanted to play. Judge Cole turned a page in the file in front of her, and when she looked up again, her eyes moved to Ethan and Nora, sitting together in the gallery, and her expression softened, just slightly, the way I imagine it must soften whenever she looks at a child who has already survived more than any child should have to. I want to speak directly to you two, if that's all right, she said, and both children nodded, wide-eyed, and I felt Nora's hand tighten in mine. Ethan, Nora, Judge Cole said, I want you both to understand something very clearly, because I don't think it's been said to you plainly enough. And every child deserves to hear this plainly, at least once. You are brother and sister. Not because of any piece of paper, though the pieces of paper in this file do, as it happens, agree with me. You are brother and sister because your parents raised you as brother and sister, because your grandmother has fought, quietly and for 2 years, to keep you together, and because the law of this state And frankly, the law of basic human decency recognizes that family is built through love and commitment, not merely through shared blood. Nothing said at a dinner table changes that. Nothing said in this courtroom today by anyone changes that either. You belong together, and you belong with your grandmother, exactly as you have for the last 2 years. And that arrangement is not up for discussion, today or ever, unless it is you, when you are grown, who chooses otherwise. I watched Nora's shoulders finally, fully release, watched 2 years of quietly carried doubt visibly lift from an 11-year-old girl's small frame. And I did not try to stop the tears that came to my own eyes in that moment. Because some things are simply too large to hold back, and I did not want to hold them back. Ethan, beside her, let out a small, startled sound that was half laugh and half sob, and Patricia reached over and squeezed my free hand. And I understood. Sitting in that unremarkable wood-paneled courtroom under fluorescent lights, that I had just watched a promise I made at a graveside 2 years earlier, finally, fully honored. Judge Cole was not finished. She turned her attention back to Daniel, and her voice, when she addressed him again, had lost none of its earlier edge. Mr. Ellison, I am going to enter your petition into the record as denied, on the grounds that it presents no legal basis whatsoever for modifying an existing guardianship order. And further, on the grounds that the circumstances surrounding its filing raise significant concern about the motivations behind it. I want to say something to you now, not as a judge, but as a person who has spent 26 years watching what happens to children in families like yours. You had every opportunity over the last 2 years to be a source of stability and love for 2 grieving children who lost their parents in a single, senseless accident. Instead, you chose, at a moment meant for celebration, to rank them, to tell one child she was wanted and the other she was not. I do not know what led you to believe that was an acceptable thing to say, but I want you to sit with the fact that a courtroom full of strangers found it appalling within about 30 seconds of hearing it read aloud. I would encourage you to sit with that fact for considerably longer than 30 seconds. Daniel did not respond. He stood there, still on his feet from when he had risen to address the court, and I watched something crumple in his face, not the crumpling of anger, but something closer to genuine shame, the kind that arrives too late to undo the damage it should have prevented in the first place. Vanessa had gone very still beside him, her pearls catching the fluorescent light, her earlier confidence entirely drained away. And I found, watching the 2 of them stand there in the wreckage of their own certainty, that I did not feel the triumph I might have expected to feel. I felt mostly an old familiar sadness, the sadness of a mother watching her son become smaller than she had raised him to be. Judge Cole signed the order affirming the guardianship, a formality now, a simple continuation of what had already been true for 2 years. And as she did, she looked up one more time, this time addressing the whole room rather than any single person in it. This hearing is concluded. I would ask everyone here to remember something on their way out of this courtroom today. Family is not a hierarchy to be sorted by blood tests and paperwork. Family is a choice, made and remade every single day in 1,000 small acts of love, or 1,000 small acts of neglect. I have made my decision today based on the law, but I suspect all of you already knew, long before you walked into this room, which choice had actually been made, and by whom. We walked out of that courtroom together, all of us, Ethan's hand in mine, Nora's hand in Patricia's, Grace Whitfield and Diane trailing behind us with the quiet satisfaction of people who had done exactly what they came to do. Daniel and Vanessa lingered in the hallway behind us, and as we reached the courthouse doors, I heard footsteps hurrying to catch up, and I turned to find my son standing there, his composure entirely gone, his eyes red in a way I had not seen since his brother's funeral. "Mom," he said, and his voice cracked on the single word. "Mom, wait, please." I stopped. The children stopped beside me, and I felt Nora's hand tighten in mine again, this time not with fear, but with something more like wariness, the wariness of a child who has learned, painfully, not to trust apologies that arrive only after consequences have already landed. I understood that wariness completely, and I did not rush to reassure her out of it. "I don't know what happened to me," Daniel said, and the words came out in a rush, disorganized, the words of a man who has not yet had time to plan what he wants to say, and is simply saying whatever rises first. "I think, since David died, I've just felt so, I don't know, replaced somehow. Like everyone forgot I was still here, still your son. And it made me start keeping score in ways I shouldn't have. And I know that's not an excuse. I know it's not. But Mom, I never actually meant to hurt her like that. I don't know what happened to me." I looked at my son for a long moment. This man who had cried real tears at his brother's graveside, who had once, a very long time ago, been a boy who shared his toys without being asked and cried when other children were left out of games at recess. I did not doubt that some real grief lived underneath the cruelty he had shown at that table. Grief does strange, ugly things to people who do not know how to carry it honestly. But I had learned something over the last 2 years that I was not willing to unlearn simply because my son was finally, belatedly, crying in a courthouse hallway. "Daniel," I said, "I believe that you're sorry right now, in this hallway, in this moment. I do believe that. But I want you to understand something because I think it matters more than any apology you could offer today. Nora heard what you said. She packed a bag because of what you said. She sat on the edge of her bed Friday night and asked me, an 11-year-old girl, whether she was going to have to leave the only home she's known since she was 4 months old, because her uncle stood up at a dinner table and told her, in front of everyone she loves, that she wasn't real family. An apology to me doesn't undo that. If you want forgiveness, and I hope for your own sake that you do, it isn't me you need to ask. And it isn't going to be given in a single hallway conversation on the day a judge just told you exactly how wrong you were. It's going to take a long time, Daniel. Longer than you probably want to hear right now, and it's going to have to be earned, slowly, in front of her, not around her. I watched that land on him, watched him absorb it the way a person absorbs a truth they already suspected but had hoped, somehow, to avoid hearing stated plainly. He looked past me then to Nora, standing quietly beside me with Ethan's hand in hers now, both children watching their uncle with the careful, guarded expressions of people deciding how much of themselves it was safe to offer. Daniel knelt down, slowly, so that he was at eye level with his niece, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, and I understood that he was searching, genuinely searching, for words equal to what he had done, and finding, as anyone would, that no such words entirely existed. "Nora," he finally said, "I am so sorry. What I said was cruel, and it was wrong, and it was never true, not for one single day. You have always been my niece. I let something ugly in me get bigger than the truth, and I let it out at the worst possible moment, in front of everyone, and I understand if it takes you a very long time to trust that I mean this. I would understand if it takes forever. But I am going to spend as long as it takes trying to show you, not just tell you, that I know exactly how wrong I was. Nora looked at him for a long moment, her 11-year-old face doing the complicated work of deciding what to do with an apology that had arrived 3 days and 1 courtroom too late. She did not throw her arms around him. She did not tell him it was okay, because it was not okay. And I was proud of her in that moment for not pretending otherwise simply to make an adult more comfortable. But she did, finally, nod once, a small, measured gesture that acknowledged the apology without yet extending forgiveness. And I understood that this, precisely this, small and honest and unhurried, was exactly the response a child in her position ought to be allowed to give. "Okay," she said simply, and it was enough for that hallway on that day. We drove home in near silence, the winter sun still bright and sharp through the windshield, and somewhere around the halfway point, Ethan spoke up from the back seat, his voice small but steady. "Grandma," he said, "is it really true, what the judge said, that nothing can ever split us up?" "It's really true," I told him, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. "It's been true for 2 years, actually. I just never told either of you because I hoped you would never need to know it. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I think, looking back, maybe you both deserve to carry that certainty with you all along, instead of finding out only when things got hard." "I'm glad you told us today," Nora said quietly, from the passenger seat beside me, her hand resting on the window, watching the winter fields blur past. Even if it took Uncle Daniel being awful for us to hear it. I did not have a good answer to that because she was right, and there is no version of this story where I can pretend that a happier, gentler occasion should have been the one to reveal a truth this important. Sometimes the truth only becomes visible when something cruel forces it into the light, and all a person can do, once that happens, is make absolutely certain the light, once it arrives, never goes dark again. The weeks that followed Monday's hearing did not resolve into some simple, tidy peace, the kind you might expect from a story with a judge's gavel and a clear moral lesson. Real families, I have learned, do not heal in straight lines. Daniel called every week for the first month, tentative, awkward calls in which he mostly asked how the children were doing and mostly received short, honest answers from me about exactly how much repair work remained ahead of him. He sent Nora a card for her 12th birthday in the spring. Not an extravagant gift, nothing designed to buy back what words alone had broken. Simply a card with a handwritten note that read, in part, "I am proud to be your uncle, and I am going to keep showing up until you believe I mean it." She kept that card. I found it months later, tucked inside the same drawer where she keeps the few photographs she has of her mother. And I understood, seeing it there, that some small, cautious door had opened, even if it had not yet been walked all the way through. Vanessa, I will tell you honestly, did not change as quickly, or perhaps at all, in any way I was able to witness firsthand. She and Daniel separated 18 months after that Christmas, for reasons that were their own and that I do not fully know the details of, though I have my suspicions about how much that dinner table conversation and everything it revealed about the kind of household she wanted to build contributed to the widening distance between them. I do not take pleasure in that outcome. I only note it because I believe the way we treat children in our care tends eventually to reveal something true about the whole architecture of a marriage, a family, a life. Nora is 14 now, as I tell you this story, tall and sharp-witted, with her mother Rachel's exact laugh, the kind that starts small and then surprises everyone in the room by how completely it takes over. Ethan is 12, still cheerful, still easy, though he has grown quieter and more protective of his sister since that Christmas. watching over her in small, unspoken ways that remind me, sometimes, painfully, of his father. They are, both of them, thriving in every ordinary, unremarkable way that matters most. Good grades and messy bedrooms and squabbles over the television remote, and birthday parties and school plays where I sit in the front row and cry every single time. Because I understand, in a way I hope none of you ever have to learn firsthand, exactly how easily this ordinary, unremarkable happiness could have been taken from them. I think about that Christmas dinner often, more often than I would like, if I am honest with you. I think about the sound of Nora's small feet on the staircase, the careful way she folded that sweater, the quiet dignity with which an 11-year-old girl accepted what she believed to be her fate, rather than cause any further trouble for the brother she loved more than her own comfort. I think about how close we came, as a family, to letting that happen, to letting one cruel sentence at a dinner table undo 2 years of love simply because nobody in that room, in that first frozen moment, found the courage to stand up and say no. But I think more than anything about the folder in my desk drawer, sitting quietly beneath old warranty cards for 2 years, waiting patiently for a moment I hoped would never come. I think about the rainy Tuesday I drove myself to Grace Whitfield's office, not because I suspected anything specific yet, but because some old, stubborn instinct in me refused to trust that grief and love alone would be enough to hold a fractured family together forever. I have thought many times since about how many grandmothers out there are living in exactly the position I was in 2 years before that Christmas, raising grandchildren after unimaginable loss, trusting that family will simply do the right thing when the moment comes, never quite getting around to making the right thing legally, permanently certain. If there is one thing I would want you to carry away from this story, it is this. Love is essential, but love unprotected is fragile in ways we do not always want to admit, especially inside our own families, especially among people we have every reason to believe should already know better. If you are raising a grandchild, a niece, a nephew, any child who came into your care through circumstance rather than simple biology, and you have not yet made that arrangement legally certain, I am asking you, gently but urgently, to consider doing so. Not because you expect cruelty from the people you love. I did not expect it either, not really. Not until it arrived at my own table on a night meant for candlelight and gratitude. But because children deserve certainty that does not depend on anyone's mood or grief or resentment holding steady. They deserve a home that cannot be reshuffled by a single cruel sentence over a Christmas turkey. Nora asked me once, about a year after that hearing, why I had never told her about the guardianship order before that Friday night. We were sitting on the back porch, late spring, the two of us shelling peas from the garden the way Rachel used to teach her, and she asked the question quietly, almost shyly, as though she were not sure she had the right to ask it at all. I told her the truth, which was that I had wanted, more than almost anything, for her to grow up never once feeling the weight of that particular fear, never once wondering whether she belonged. I told her I was sorry that instinct had ultimately failed, that the fear had found her anyway, at a dinner table, from a person who should have protected her from it instead. She was quiet for a long moment, working a pod open with her thumbs, and then she said something I have carried with me every day since, something I think about far more often than I think about that Christmas dinner itself. I think I'm glad it happened the way it did, she said. Not the mean part, but I think I needed to hear the judge say it, out loud, in that room, more than I needed you to just tell me quietly at home. I needed to know it wasn't just something you believed because you loved me. I needed to know it was just true. I did not have an answer for that, not right away, because I think she had understood something in that moment that had taken me considerably longer than 14 years to fully understand myself. Sometimes the people we love most cannot simply tell us we are safe. Sometimes we need to see it proven, in the harsh, unforgiving light of a moment we never wanted to face, before we can finally, fully believe it. I am grateful, more grateful than I can properly express, that when that moment came for my granddaughter, there was a folder waiting in a drawer, a judge waiting behind a bench, and a grandmother standing at the top of a staircase, ready to say the only words that mattered. You are not going anywhere. I want to ask you something before I let you go tonight. Have you ever had a moment in your own family when you had to decide, in a single instant, whether to stay silent or to stand between someone you love and the person hurting them? Have you ever had to prove, out loud, to a child that they belonged, not because you told them so, but because you had already, quietly, made certain of it long before they ever needed the proof? If this story found something true in you tonight, I would love to hear about it in the comments below, wherever you are watching from. Whatever kitchen table or quiet living room has become the place where you listen to stories like this one. And if it moved you even a little, I would be so grateful if you would take a moment to like this video and subscribe, so that stories like Nora's, stories about the quiet, stubborn love that holds families together even when the people inside them fail each other, can keep finding their way to the people who need them most. Family, I have come to believe, after everything this story cost and everything it eventually restored, is not a matter of blood tests or birth certificates, or the careless words a person might say across a table on the worst night of a child's year. Family is a promise, made quietly, kept faithfully, and defended, when it must be, with everything a person has. I made that promise at my son's graveside, with my hands on the shoulders of 2 frightened children, and I have spent every day since honoring it, in courtrooms and kitchens alike, in manila folders and cinnamon rolls, in the small, unglamorous, relentless work of making sure that no child in my care would ever again have to wonder, even for a single night, whether she belonged. She did. She does. She always will. And that, in the end, was the only verdict that ever truly mattered.